It was a Sunday morning like any other. The sun was filtering through the curtains of our Parisian apartment, and I was enjoying my coffee while absent-mindedly leafing through some old papers. My wife, Sophie, had left to run a few errands, leaving me alone with my thoughts and this pile of documents we'd neglected for far too long. I didn't expect this ordinary morning to change the course of our lives. As I leafed through these yellowed papers, my eyes suddenly fell on a document that seemed different from the others. It was a piece of property writing, neatly folded and tucked between two invoices. Intrigued, I carefully unfolded it, my fingers trembling slightly with curiosity. Property of Mme Jean Dubois, I read at the top of the document. Jean Dubois, my mother-in-law. I blinked in disbelief. A house. My mother-in-law owned a house we'd never heard of. I stood up abruptly, almost spilling my cup of coffee. My mind was racing. Jean had always claimed to live modestly, subsisting only on her meager pension. How many times had we heard her complain about how hard it was to make ends meet? How many times had Sophie and I dipped into our savings to help her out? I read the document again and again, looking for a logical explanation. Perhaps it was a mistake. An unimportant old paper. But no, the date was recent, and the address very real, a small house in a quiet suburb of Paris. 1,000 questions raced through my head. Why had Jean hidden the existence of this property from us? How long had she owned it? And above all, where had the money to buy it come from? I sat down heavily on the sofa, the document still in my hands. I felt betrayed, confused and strangely angry. Our relationship with Jean had always been complicated, but I'd never imagined she could hide something so important from us. The sound of the front door startled me. Sophie had returned. I hurriedly put the document away in the pile of papers. I couldn't talk to her about it, not now, not until I knew more. "Is everything all right, darling?" asked Sophie as she entered the living room, her arms laden with bags. I forced a smile. Yes, everything's fine. Just a little tired from all the paperwork." She looked at me suspiciously, but didn't insist. I got up to help her put the groceries away, my mind still focused on this shocking discovery. The next few days were a torment. I could think of nothing else but this secret. Every time I saw Sophie, I felt like I was betraying her by keeping this information to myself. But I knew I had to know more before I could tell her. I began to make discreet inquiries. During my lunch breaks, I would go to the town hall to consult the property registers. In the evenings, once Sophie was asleep, I would spend hours on the internet, searching for information about the house and its history. Gradually, the picture became clearer. The house had been bought 5 years ago, shortly after the death of Sophie's father. I remembered the many discussions we'd had at the time with Jean, who insisted that we shouldn't worry about her financially. One evening, as I was coming home late from work, exhausted from my secret research, Sophie was waiting for me in the living room, looking preoccupied. "Pierre, what's going on?" she asked softly. "You've been distant lately. Are you having problems at work?" I felt my heart clench. I hated lying to him, but I wasn't yet ready to share my discovery. "No, everything's fine at work," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "I'm just a little stressed right now." Sophie didn't insist, but I could see she wasn't convinced. This situation couldn't go on. I had to make a decision, either tell her everything, or find a way to confirm my suspicions once and for all. That's when I remembered my childhood friend Francois, who worked as an estate agent. Perhaps he could help me find out more about this mysterious property. The next day, I called him on the pretext of checking up on him. After a few minutes of casual conversation, I said, "Tell me, Francois, you're still working in real estate, aren't you?" "Yes, why? Are you looking to move?" he replied, surprised. No, I said, laughing nervously. "Actually, I could use a small favor. It's a bit tricky." I explained the situation, deliberately omitting to mention that it was my mother-in-law. Francois hesitated for a moment, but finally agreed to help me. "I'll see what I can find out," he promised. "I'll call you back as soon as I hear anything." The days that followed were interminable. Every time my phone rang, I was startled, hoping it was Francois with information. Sophie noticed my strange behavior, but I continued to dodge her questions. Finally, a week later, Francois called me back. "I found something interesting," he said in a deep voice. "The house you told me about, it sold 2 months ago." I felt my heart stop. "Sold?" I repeated, incredulous. "Yes, for quite a substantial sum in fact. The owner made a handsome capital gain." I thanked Francois in a blank voice and hung up. My head was spinning. Not only had Jean kept this house a secret from us, she'd recently sold it without a word to Sophie or me. I dropped into a chair, overwhelmed by a mixture of anger, confusion, and betrayal. What was I to do now? How was I going to tell Sophie? And above all, what had Jean done with all that money? I knew I could no longer keep this secret to myself. It was time to face the truth, painful as it was. But first, I had to know more. I had to understand why Jean had lied to us all these years. With a resigned sigh, I took out my phone and dialed my mother-in-law's number. It was time to have a serious conversation. Francois' revelation had opened a Pandora's box that I could no longer close. Jean's house, a property we'd never known existed until recently, had been sold. My mother-in-law's secret had taken on a new, even more disturbing dimension. I spent the next few days in a state of total confusion. Every interaction with Sophie became a balancing act, trying to maintain a facade of normality while internally seething with unanswered questions. I knew I had to tell her, but how could I tell his wife that her mother had lied to us for years? One morning, while Sophie was away at work, I decided to investigate further. I contacted Francois again, hoping to find out more about this mysterious transaction. "Hello, Francois? It's Pierre. I need another favor." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Pierre, you know I shouldn't be giving you this information, don't you?" I sighed. I know, but it's important. You can't imagine how much." Francois finally gave in. "Okay, what do you want to know?" "Everything. The exact date of the sale, the amount, the buyer if possible. I'll see what I can do. Give me a few days." Those few days were a real ordeal. I spent my nights turning the problem upside down, imagining the worst-case scenarios. Was Jean in debt? Was she the victim of a scam? Or worse still, was she hiding a serious illness requiring expensive treatment? Finally, Francois called me back. His voice was tense as he told me what he'd discovered. The house was sold exactly 2.5 months ago. The selling price was €450,000. I felt my heart stop. €450,000. A colossal sum that could have changed the lives of Sophie and me, who struggled every month to make ends meet. "The buyer?" I asked in a strangled voice. "A real estate investment company. Nothing suspicious there." I thanked Francois, hung up and dropped onto the sofa, my head in my hands. Jean's betrayal was taking on a dimension I hadn't imagined. Not only had she concealed the existence of this house from us for years, she had sold it for a considerable sum without even telling us about it. The next few days were a fog of confusion and anger. I found myself observing Jean at our weekly family dinners, looking for the slightest sign of guilt on her face. But she remained unperturbed, complaining as usual about her financial difficulties. One evening, as we all gathered around the table, Jean mentioned that she was having trouble paying her bills this month. I felt anger welling up inside me, threatening to boil over. "Are you sure about this, Jean?" I asked, my voice betraying my irritation. Sophie gave me a surprised look. "Pierre, what's the matter with you?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Nothing. Sorry. But the damage was done." Sophie questioned me all evening, sensing that something was wrong. I ended up inventing a story about stress at work to justify my behavior. This situation couldn't go on. I had to confront Jean, but I couldn't do it without talking to Sophie first. After all, she was her mother. One Saturday morning, as we were having breakfast, I decided to tell him everything. "Sophie, I need to talk to you about something important." She looked up from her diary, a worried expression on her face. "What's going on, Pierre? You've been acting strange for weeks." I took a deep breath. "It's about your mother. I found out something." I told him everything. The discovery of the deed, my research, the sale of the house. As I spoke, Sophie's face went from surprise to disbelief to anger. "It's not possible," she murmured. "Mom would never do that. You must be mistaken." "I'd love to be wrong, Sophie. But I've checked and double-checked. It's the truth." Sophie stood up abruptly, spilling her cup of coffee. "No, no, no. I just can't believe it. Why would she do this? Why would she lie to us?" I stood up in turn, trying to take her in my arms, but she pushed me away. "We need to talk to him," she said in a trembling voice. "Now." Despite my protests, Sophie grabbed her phone and called her mother. A few minutes later, we were on our way to Jean's apartment. The journey was made in a heavy silence. I could see Sophie struggling with her emotions, alternating between anger and disbelief. As for me, I was dreading the coming confrontation. When we arrived at Jean's house, she greeted us with her usual smile, oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold. "Sophie, Pierre, what a nice surprise. Come in, come in." We followed her into her small salon. Sophie wasted no time in preambles. "Mom, we need to talk. Pierre has discovered something." I took over, calmly explaining what I'd discovered. As I went on, I saw Jean's face fall. When I mentioned the sale of the house, she paled visibly. How did you know?" she stammered. This simple question was a confession. Sophie let out a strangled sob. "So it's true. Have you really been lying to us all these years?" Jean lowered her eyes, unable to hold her daughter's gaze. I can explain everything." But her explanations rang hollow. She spoke of an investment that would ensure a better future for us all, of an opportunity she couldn't pass up. The more she spoke, the angrier I felt. "What about the money?" I asked, interrupting his stream of excuses. "What did you do with the 450,000 euros? Jean froze. "How do you know the exact amount?" I realized my mistake too late. I had revealed the extent of my research, perhaps shattering Jean's trust in me. But at this point, it didn't really matter. "It doesn't matter how I know," I replied firmly. "What matters is that you lied to us. You let us worry about you, help you financially, while you owned a house and now a considerable sum of money." Sophie, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Why, Mom? Why did you hide all this from us?" Jean's face twisted with guilt. "I wanted to protect you. I wanted to secure your future. I made an investment that would change everything for us." "What kind of investment?" asked I, skeptically. Jean hesitated. A business opportunity. A friend told me about an investment that promised incredible returns. I thought I could multiply the money and offer you a better life." My heart sank. I was beginning to understand where this story was going. "Jean," I said softly, "where's the money now?" She burst into tears. I don't know. The investment, it didn't go as planned. The money's gone." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie seemed frozen, unable to react to this new revelation. As for me, I felt a mixture of anger and pity. Jean may have acted with the best of intentions, but she had lost everything. And not just the money, but also our trust. As we left Jean's apartment that day, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The secret of the house sale had been revealed, but it had opened a Pandora's box whose consequences we were far from fully aware of. The days following our discovery were marked by palpable tension. Sophie oscillated between anger and grief, unable to understand her mother's actions. As for me, I felt guilty for having been the one to bring this secret to light, even though I knew it was necessary. We decided to take a step back before confronting Jean again. We needed time to digest the information and think about how we were going to handle this delicate situation. 2 weeks passed in a silence heavy with unspoken words. Sophie avoided her mother's calls, claiming she had a busy schedule. I knew this situation couldn't last forever. One Saturday morning, as we ate breakfast, Sophie took a deep breath and said, "I think it's time we talk to Mom." Really talk. Not like last time when we were all too emotional to have a constructive conversation. I nodded slowly. "You're right. We can't let this situation drag on. What do you suggest? A dinner party, she replied. At our place. Neutral ground, as it were. We can talk calmly, without either of us being able to escape. It seemed like a good idea. We decided to invite Jean for dinner the following Saturday. Sophie called her, trying to keep her tone light despite the obvious tension in her voice. The week flew by. We were both nervous about this confrontation. Saturday finally arrived, and with it, growing anxiety. I spent the day preparing dinner, hoping that the good food would soften the atmosphere a little. Sophie, meanwhile, was pacing the apartment, nervously rearranging the sofa cushions. At precisely 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. Sophie and I exchanged a glance before she opened the door. Jean entered, looking visibly uncomfortable. She was holding a bouquet of flowers, which she awkwardly handed to her daughter. Good evening, my darling. Pierre. Thank you for the invitation. Dinner began in an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the clatter of cutlery. I tried to make a few remarks about the weather and current events, but my efforts to get the conversation going fell flat. Finally, as I cleared the plates of the main course, Sophie spoke up. Mom, we need to talk about what happened. The house, the money, everything. Jean put down her towel, her face visibly tensing. I know. I'm sorry. I don't know where to start. From the beginning, I suggested gently, sitting back down. How did you acquire this house? Jean took a deep breath. It was shortly after your father died, Sophie. I received a life insurance policy that I never told you about. At the time, I thought it was for the best. I didn't want you to worry about me. Sophie shook her head in disbelief. But Mom, we've always worried about you. We've helped you financially for years, thinking you were struggling to make ends meet. I know, Jean murmured, tears in her eyes. I was selfish. I thought I could handle it all by myself. What about selling the house? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Why did you decide to sell it? Jean's face decomposed. I met a man, Jacques. He told me about an incredible investment opportunity. He promised me I could double or even triple my money in a few months. Sophie let out a groan. Oh, Mom. I know it was stupid, Jean continued, tears running freely down her cheeks. But I thought I could finally give you the life you deserved. A beautiful inheritance, financial security. But the money's gone, I said softly. Jean nodded, unable to speak. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie stood up abruptly, walking to the window with her back to us. I can't believe it, she said finally, her voice trembling with restrained anger. All those years we worried about you, sacrificed our own savings to help you. And all the while, you had this house, this money. I'm sorry, Jean repeated, her voice barely audible. Sorry isn't good enough, Mom, exploded Sophie, turning around abruptly. You lied to us. 4 years. How can we ever trust you again? I stood up, trying to calm the situation. Sophie, please. But Sophie was on a roll. Years of pent-up frustration and anger seemed to explode all at once. And now what? You've lost everything. How could you be so irresponsible? So selfish. Jean was sobbing openly now, unable to respond to her daughter's accusations. I approached Sophie, placing a hand on her shoulder. Honey, I understand your anger. But maybe we should. She pulled away abruptly. No, Pierre. Don't defend her. Not this time. I stepped back, surprised by the vehemence of her reaction. I'd never seen her so angry. Jean stood up slowly, trembling. I'd better go. I'm really sorry. For everything. She headed for the door, but stopped before stepping out. Sophie, I love you. I hope one day you can forgive me. The door closed softly behind her, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Sophie collapsed on the sofa, burying her face in her hands. I sat down beside her, not knowing what to say or do. How could she do this to us? She murmured between sobs. I put an arm around her shoulders, holding her close. I don't know, honey. I don't know. We stayed like that for what seemed like hours, lost in thought, trying to figure out how we'd got there. The next morning, the atmosphere in our apartment was heavy. Sophie had barely slept, her red, puffy eyes testifying to her restless night. "What are we going to do now?" she asked, staring at her untouched cup of coffee. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know. But we can't leave things the way they are. Your mother made a mistake, a big mistake, but..." "But what, Pierre?" interrupted Sophie, a flash of anger in her eyes. "You want us to forgive him? Forget everything?" "No, of course not," I replied softly. "But she's still your mother. Our family. Maybe we should try to figure out why she did this." Sophie shook her head. "I'm not ready. Not now." I respected her decision, knowing that she needed time to process all this. The days that followed were tense. Sophie systematically avoided her mother's calls, and I often found myself acting as intermediary, reassuring Jean that her daughter just needed time. A week after our confrontation, I came home from work to find Sophie sitting on the sofa, looking pensive. "I've been thinking," she said when I sat down next to her. "I think we should talk to Mom. Again. But this time, I want to know exactly what happened with that investment." I nodded slowly. "Are you sure?" "No," she admitted with a mirthless chuckle. "But I think it's necessary. To get ahead." The next day, we invited Jean again. This time, the mood was different. Less explosive, but just as tense. Jean told us all about it. How she had met Jacques at a neighborhood reunion. How he had told her about the opportunity to invest in a promising startup. How she'd been seduced by the idea of finally being able to offer her daughter the financial security she deserved. But where exactly did the money go? I asked, sensing something wasn't quite right about the whole thing. Jean lowered her eyes. "I don't know exactly. Jacques told me that the company had gone bankrupt. That everything was lost." Sophie and I exchanged glances. The whole thing smacked of a scam. "Mom," Sophie said softly, "I think you've been the victim of a scam." Jean raised tear-filled eyes to her daughter. You think?" "It looks very much like it," I confirmed. "Do you have any documents about this investment? Any contracts?" Jean shook her head. "Just a few emails. Jacques said everything had to be kept discreet for tax reasons." I felt my heart clench. Jean had not only been careless, she had been so naive as to fall into a crude trap. "We should go to the police," I suggested. "Press charges." But Jean seemed terrified at the thought. No, I can't. I'm ashamed. What if I'm in trouble?" Sophie took her mother's hand for the first time in weeks. "Mom, you're a victim. We're going to help you. We'll get through this together." I saw Jean's shoulders slump with relief. For the first time since this whole affair began, I felt a little hopeful. Perhaps this ordeal, painful as it was, could bring us closer together as a family. Of course, it would be a long road. Broken trust can't be repaired overnight. But as the three of us sat there, I felt we had taken a first step towards healing. The days following our last conversation with Jean were a whirlwind of emotions and action. Sophie and I had decided to help her mother untangle this complex situation, but we hadn't expected the magnitude of what was to come. On Monday morning, I took a day off to accompany Jean to the police station. Sophie, still too emotional to handle the situation, preferred to go to work. The car journey was silent, Jean looking out of the window, clearly nervous. "It's going to be okay," I said softly as I parked in front of the police station. "You're the victim here, Jean. The police are here to help you." She nodded, unconvinced, but followed me inside. The officer who received us, a woman in her 40s named Lieutenant Dubois, listened attentively to our story. Her face darkened as Jean detailed her meeting with Jacques and the investment that had gone wrong. "Madam," she said finally, "I'm afraid you've been the victim of a well-orchestrated scam. This type of fraud is unfortunately becoming increasingly common, especially among the elderly." Jean paled at these words. You think we can get the money back?" Lieutenant Dubois sighed. "I don't want to get your hopes up. In this kind of business, it's rare to recover all the funds. But we're going to do everything we can." We spent the next few hours filling in forms, providing every detail Jean could remember about Jacques and the investment. By the time we finally emerged from the police station, it was almost noon. "Would you like something to eat?" I offered Jean, seeing how exhausted she looked. She shook her head. "No, I just want to go home. I need to be alone for a while." I took her home, promising to keep her informed of any developments. When I got home, I found Sophie waiting for me, anxious for news. "Well?" she asked as soon as I walked through the door. I told her about our morning at the police station, the police reaction, the forms to fill in. Sophie listened attentively, her face going from worry to anger to resignation. "So the money really is lost," she murmured finally. "Probably a lot of it, yes," I admitted. "But the police will investigate. There may be a chance of recovering something." Sophie dropped onto the sofa, looking despondent. How could she be so naive? I sat down next to her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "Your mother meant well. She thought she could secure a better future for us. By lying to us for years," retorted Sophie, but her voice lacked conviction. Anger gave way to sadness. The following weeks were a mixture of anxious waiting and clumsy attempts to resume a normal life. Jean called us almost every day, sometimes to apologize again, sometimes to ask about the investigation. A month after our visit to the police station, Lieutenant Dubois contacted us to inform us that they had identified several victims of the same swindler. Jacques, whose real name was Etienne Messia, was a professional conman wanted in several regions of France. This news, while confirming our suspicions, left us with a bitter taste. Knowing that Jean wasn't the only victim didn't make the loss any easier to accept. It was over dinner, some 6 weeks after our initial confrontation, that Jean finally confessed everything. "There's something I haven't told you," she began, her voice barely audible. Sophie and I exchanged worried glances. "What more could there be?" I didn't invest all the money from the house sale," Jean continued, her eyes glued to her plate. "What?" exclaimed Sophie. "But you told us." Jean raised a trembling hand to interrupt him. "I know what I said. I was ashamed. I kept some of the money. About 100,000 euros. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. I felt Sophie stiffen beside me, clearly struggling to control her emotions. "Why did you lie to us again?" I asked softly, trying to keep my tone neutral. Jean looked up at last, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was afraid. Afraid you'd think I was completely irresponsible. Afraid you'd never forgive me for losing so much money." Sophie stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. "And you thought lying to us again was the answer?" Her voice trembled with anger and disappointment. "Sophie, please," Jean pleaded. "I've made a mistake, I know. But I want to make things right. This money, I want to give it to you. To both of you." This statement took us both by surprise. I looked at Sophie, trying to gauge her reaction. Her face was a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Give us the money," she repeated slowly. "Just like that?" Jean nodded vigorously. "Yes. It's the least I can do after all I've done. You deserve this money more than I do." I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "Jean, that's very generous of you. But are you sure? This money is all you have left?" "I'm sure," she asserted with a determination I'd never seen from her before. "I have my retirement, I have my apartment. I can live simply. But you have your whole life ahead of you. This money could help you realize your dreams." Sophie, who had remained silent, slowly approached her mother. "Mom," she said softly, "I don't know what to say. I'm still angry with you for all those lies. But I can see you're trying to make amends." Jean took her daughter's hands in hers. "I know I have a lot to make up for. I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I hope that in time." Her voice broke and Sophie, in a gesture that surprised me, took her in her arms. I looked at them, mother and daughter embracing, both crying, and felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't the end of our problems, far from it, but perhaps it was the beginning of a new chapter. The next few days were devoted to serious discussions about the future. We finally decided to accept Jean's offer, but with conditions. Part of the money would be set aside for her own future needs, the rest would be invested prudently for our future. The investigation into the scam continued, but we had little hope of recovering the lost money. However, being able to be honest with each other, confronting our mistakes and fears, seemed to have paved the way for a slow but sure recovery. One evening, as we sat on our balcony, watching the sun set over Paris, Sophie took my hand. "You know," she said softly, "I think this ordeal has finally brought us closer together. Mom and me, you and me, all of us as a family." I squeezed his hand, pondering his words. "You're right. It hasn't been easy, and it probably won't be for a while yet. But we're together. That's what matters." Sophie rested her head on my shoulder. "Thank you for being there every step of the way. I don't know how I would have handled all this without you." I kissed him on the forehead, feeling a wave of love and gratitude wash over me. Despite all the difficulties, despite the lies and betrayals, here we were, together, stronger than before. The truth had come out, painful and brutal. But out of that explosion had come a new understanding, a new connection between us. And as the Paris sky darkened, I felt a renewed hope for our future. Whatever tomorrow brought, we would face it together, as a family. The weeks following Jean's confession were an emotional whirlwind. Sophie and I struggled to come to terms with everything that had happened, while trying to get on with our lives. But fate had other plans for us. One evening, while we were having dinner at home, Sophie broached a subject that caught me completely off guard. "Pierre," she began, hesitantly, "there's something I'd like to talk to you about. It's about our origins." I looked up from my plate, intrigued. "Our origins? What do you mean?" Sophie took a deep breath. "Well, you know I've always been curious about our family history. With everything that's happened recently, I decided to do a little research." My heart began to beat faster. I had a bad feeling about where this conversation was going. "I took a DNA test," Sophie continued. "You know, one of those tests you can order online to find out about your origins." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "And, what did you find out?" Sophie looked me straight in the eye. "Pierre, the results are surprising. It seems that I have origins that I never suspected. Origins that don't correspond at all to what my parents always told me." I felt my stomach knot. "Sophie, there's something I have to tell you." But before I could continue, Sophie interrupted, "Pierre, I think I've been adopted." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at Sophie, seeing the confusion and pain in her eyes. This was the moment. The moment I'd been dreading for years. "Sophie," I said softly, taking her hands in mine, "there's something I've known for a long time. Something I should have told you years ago." She looked at me, wide-eyed. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. "You're right. You are adopted. But that's not the whole story. The truth is, it was my biological parents who adopted you." Sophie abruptly removed her hands from mine, leaping to her feet. "What? How? How is this possible? How do you know?" I stood up in turn, trying to approach her, but she backed away. "I found out the truth years ago. My parents, our parents, told me all about it when I turned 18. Sophie's face was a mixture of shock, confusion, and anger. "You knew about this all this time, and you didn't tell me?" "I wanted to protect you," I explained, feeling guilt wash over me. "I didn't want to disturb your relationship with your adoptive parents." "With Jean?" Sophie shook her head in disbelief. "Protecting me? By lying to me? By keeping the truth about my origins from me?" I tried to approach again, but she raised her hand to stop me. "No, Pierre. Don't come any closer. I need space. I need to think." Without another word, she left the room, slamming our bedroom door behind her. I stood there, in the middle of our living room, feeling more alone than ever. The next few days were a nightmare. Sophie avoided me, sleeping in the guest room and leaving for work before I got up. On the rare occasions we crossed paths, the atmosphere was tense, full of unspoken words and silent reproaches. A week after my revelation, Sophie finally broke her silence. "We have to talk to Jean," she said one evening as I was coming home from work. "She needs to know that we know the truth." I nodded slowly. You're right. We should do it together. Sophie looked at me, and for the first time in days, I saw something other than anger in her eyes. Sadness, confusion, but also a glimmer of determination. All right, she said. Give her a call. Ask her to come tomorrow night. The next evening arrived too quickly for my liking. Jean rang our doorbell at 7 p.m. sharp, unaware of the drama that awaited her. Good evening, darlings, she said as we entered, her smile quickly fading when she saw our serious expressions. What's going on? Sophie took a deep breath. Mom, please sit down. We need to talk to you about something important. Jean sat down slowly on the sofa, her gaze shifting from Sophie to me with concern. Mom, Sophie began, her voice trembling, I know I'm adopted. Jean's face paled instantly. What? But, how? I did a DNA test, Sophie explained. And Pierre confirmed the truth. Jean turned to me, eyes wide. Did you know? I nodded, unable to speak. But that's not all, Sophie continued. I also discovered that my biological parents are actually Pierre's parents. A heavy silence fell over the room. Jean seemed to have aged 10 years in the space of a few seconds. I don't know what to say, she murmured finally. We wanted to protect you both. We thought we were doing the right thing. Sophie shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. By lying to us? By keeping the truth about our origins from us? My darling, Jean pleaded, reaching out for her daughter, we loved you from the very first moment. You were our daughter, no matter the biology. But you lied to me, exclaimed Sophie. My whole life has been a lie. I approached gently, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. That's not true. The love your parents gave you was real. The memories we created together are real. Sophie turned to me, her eyes bright with tears. What about you? How could you keep this secret all these years? I felt my heart clench. I wanted to protect you. I didn't want to disturb your relationship with your parents. With Jean. I was afraid. I was afraid of losing you. Jean intervened, her voice trembling. Sophie, Pierre, I'm so sorry. We should never have kept the truth from you. We thought we were doing the right thing, but we were wrong. Sophie collapsed on the sofa, sobbing. I sat down beside her, wanting to comfort her but not knowing if my touch would be welcome. I need to know, Sophie finally said between sobs. Why? Why did they abandon me? Jean took a deep breath. They didn't abandon you, darling. They died in a car accident shortly after you were born. Pierre was with his grandmother that day. We were their best friends, and we promised to take care of you both if anything happened to them. This revelation was like a punch in the stomach. I knew my biological parents were dead, but I'd never known the exact details. So, we really are brother and sister, Sophie murmured, looking at me with new eyes. I nodded, not knowing what to say. How are we supposed to handle this? Asked Sophie, her voice barely audible. Together, I said softly. Like we always have. We're a family, Sophie. Maybe not in the way we thought, but we are a family. Jean looked at us, tears in her eyes. I know you have every reason to be angry with me. At us. But know that we have always loved you, with all our hearts. You are our children, no matter what biology says. Sophie stood up slowly, approaching Jean. For a moment, I feared she was going to attack her, but to my surprise, she threw herself into her arms, sobbing harder. Mom, she whispered between sobs. I need time to digest all this. But you're my mother. You always will be. I looked at them, feeling my own tears fall. This revelation had changed everything, and yet, somehow, nothing had changed. We were still a family, bound by love rather than blood. As we stood there, the three of us in each other's arms, I knew the road ahead would be long and hard. There would be questions, doubts, maybe even anger. But we would face it all together, as we always had. This startling revelation was not the end of our story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the truth, painful as it was, might enable us to build even stronger bonds. The days that followed this revelation were an emotional whirlwind. Sophie and I found ourselves in a situation we could never have imagined, trying to navigate unknown and tumultuous waters. The morning after our confrontation with Jean, I awoke with a profound sense of unease. The reality of our situation hit me hard. Sophie, the woman I'd loved for years, was in fact my biological sister. How were we supposed to deal with this? I found Sophie in the kitchen, staring absently into her coffee cup. When she looked up at me, I saw a mixture of confusion, pain, and something I couldn't quite identify. "Hello," I said softly, not really knowing how to behave. "Hello," she replied, her voice barely audible. I sat across from her, searching for the right words. "Sophie, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry I've kept the truth from you for so long." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Are you sorry? Pierre, our whole life is a lie. Our relationship, our marriage, everything." Her words hit me like a punch. "No, Sophie. Our love isn't a lie. What we feel for each other is real. But we're brother and sister," she exclaimed, her voice breaking. "How can we go on as if nothing had happened?" I reached out to take her hand, but she abruptly withdrew it. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know I love you. That hasn't changed." Sophie stood up abruptly, almost knocking over her chair. "I need some air. I can't deal with this right now." She left the apartment, leaving me alone with my swirling thoughts. The next few days were a nightmare. Sophie spent most of her time out of the apartment, avoiding any prolonged interaction with me. When we did meet, the atmosphere was tense, full of unspoken and repressed emotions. A week after the revelation, Sophie came home late one night. I waited for her in the living room, unable to sleep. "Where have you been?" I asked, worried. "I was at Jean's," she replied, collapsing onto the sofa. I needed to talk to her, to understand. I sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. "And, how did it go?" Sophie sighed deeply. "It was intense." She told me everything. How my parents, our parents, died. How she and her husband decided to adopt me. She showed me photos, letters. I felt my heart clench. "I'm sorry I wasn't there with you for this." She looked at me, her eyes bright with tears. "Pierre, I don't know who I am anymore. All my life, my identity was based on a lie. And now I find out that the man I love is really my brother. How am I supposed to handle this?" I took a deep breath. "Sophie, I know this is hard. It's hard for me too. But we're still us. Our love, our history, it's all real." "But it's wrong, isn't it?" she said, her voice barely audible. "We're brother and sister. We shouldn't be together like this." I felt my heart break a little more. I don't know what's right or wrong about this situation. All I know is how I feel about you. And those feelings haven't changed. Sophie stood up abruptly. "I need time, Pierre. I can't deal with this right now. I'm going to Jean's for a few days." I watched her go, helpless, feeling our world crumble around us. The next few days were a fog of confusion and pain. I spent my days wandering around our empty apartment, reliving every moment of our life together, wondering how it had come to this. One evening, as I stared blankly at a photo album from our wedding, there was a knock at the door. It was Jean. "Pierre," she said softly as she entered. "How are you?" I shrugged, unable to formulate a coherent answer. Jean sat down next to me, looking at the photo album. "I'm so sorry. We should never have kept the truth from you." "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice hoarse from having spoken too little in recent days. Jean sighed. "At first, it was to protect you. You were so young when your parents died. We wanted to give you a normal life, without the weight of that tragedy. And then, when you grew up and fell in love, we didn't know how to handle the situation anymore." I felt anger welling up inside me. "So you've decided to keep lying? To let us build our lives on a lie?" "We were wrong," Jean admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. "We thought we were doing the right thing, but we made a terrible mistake. I understand if you can't forgive us." I took a deep breath, trying to calm my anger. "I don't know if I can forgive. I can't now. But I understand you think you're acting for our own good." Jean put a hand on my arm. "Sophie's lost, Pierre. She needs you, even if she doesn't realize it yet. How can I help him when I'm completely lost myself? I asked, feeling despair wash over me. By being there for her, Jean replied simply. By showing her that your love is stronger than this revelation. After Jean's departure, I stayed awake all night, thinking about our situation. Early in the morning, I had made a decision. I was going to see Sophie. I found her in the park where we used to walk. She was sitting on our usual bench, looking lost in thought. "Sophie," I said softly as I approached. She looked up at me, and my heart sank as I saw the pain in her eyes. "Pierre," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" I sat down next to her, keeping some distance. "I couldn't stay away from you any longer. Sophie, I know this situation is crazy, impossible even. But my feelings for you haven't changed." She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How can you say that? We're brother and sister, Pierre. It's wrong." I took a deep breath. I don't know what's right or wrong about this situation. All I know is that I love you. That you're the most important person in my life. That we've built something beautiful together, and I don't want to lose that. Sophie looked at me, her eyes full of confusion and pain. "But how can we go on? How can we ignore what we know now?" "We can't ignore it," I admitted. "But we can decide what it means to us. Sophie, we grew up separately. We met and fell in love like two normal people. The fact that we share the same biological blood doesn't change who we are, or how we feel about each other." She remained silent for a long moment, digesting my words. Finally, she took my hand in hers. "I don't know if I can do this, Pierre," she said softly. "I need time to think, to understand who I really am." I squeezed his hand. "I understand. And I'll be there, whatever you decide. Whether it's as a husband, a brother, or just a friend. I'll always be there for you." We sat there, hand in hand, watching the sun rise on a new day. The future was uncertain, full of unanswered questions and challenges we'd never imagined. But for the first time since that shocking revelation, I felt a little hope. The emotional chaos surrounding us was far from resolved. We still had a long way to go to understand and accept our new reality. But we were no longer alone in this storm. We were together, bound by a love that defied all logic and convention. As we left the park that morning, I didn't know what the future held. But I knew one thing for sure: whatever happened, Sophie and I would face this ordeal together, as we always had. The weeks following our conversation in the park were a difficult period of transition. Sophie and I had agreed to take a step back, to give ourselves space to reflect and assimilate our new reality. She had decided to stay at Jean's for a while, which left our apartment strangely empty and silent. Every day was a challenge. I woke up thinking about Sophie, wondering how she was, how she felt. Our communications were limited to brief text messages, polite but distant exchanges that left a bitter taste in my mouth. It was against this backdrop that I decided to take matters into my own hands. If we were to rebuild our relationship, whatever it was, we had to face our demons together. I called a therapist specializing in complex family relationships and made an appointment for a family therapy session. When I proposed the idea to Sophie and Jean, I was surprised by their quick acceptance. Perhaps we were all at our wits' end, desperate to find a solution, a way forward. The day of our first session arrived faster than I could have imagined. The three of us met in the comfortable office of Dr. Martinez, a kindly-looking woman in her 50s. "Welcome," she said, inviting us to sit down. "I know you're going through an extremely difficult and unusual situation. I'm here to help you navigate these troubled waters." Sophie, sitting at the other end of the sofa, looked tense. Jean, in a nearby armchair, looked older than ever, the weight of guilt visible on her face. "Where do you want to start?" asked Dr. Martinez.